moonfire tore the cliff road as Elias staggered from the blast, and the sky bled violet over the bay. Aria said, "Run to me." He looked back and saw Cassian holding a blade bright as dawn. Lord Malric smiled like winter glass. Mira whispered, "Shield your heart." Jax hauled Elias up, boots slick with ash. Elias felt his bones split, the old change clawing free. Aria said, "Stay with me, I can hold the ward." The ward cracked like ice under thunder. Cassian said, "Choose me or burn." The sea rose, a wall of luminous spray. Silas watched from the ruins, eyes unreadable. Elias tasted iron and fear and love. Aria said, "Trust what you are." Malric raised his hand, and the moon bent, cruel and slow. Mira cried, "Not the tether." Jax said, "Elias, breathe." The change surged, fur and shadow flickering at the edges of him. Elias said, "I will not be your weapon." Malric laughed and pulled the tide toward the road. Cassian stepped closer, sorrow warring with hunger. Aria gripped Elias, light blooming from her palm. The cliff began to fall. The ward shattered like a bell. Dawn crawled over the battered port, and smoke made soft veils between fallen masts. Elias sat on the quay and counted breaths to cage the change. Aria said, "You held the line." He shook, then steadied, and watched gulls carve gray air. Mira limped to the edge and traced wards on wet stone. Jax said, "If we stay, we drown in questions." Aria reached for Elias, not to save him, but to anchor him. Cassian's shadow lingered in memory like a bruise. Malric had bent the moon, and that truth gnawed at hope. Mira said, "The tether is older than kings." Elias said, "He wants me unmade." Aria said, "He wants you unsure." The tide lapped like a whispering jury. Jax flicked a coin and missed the catch. Elias looked at the horizon and felt the shape of a choice. Aria said, "Walk beside me or I walk beside you. Either way, we move." The gulls rose as one. The day began. They reached a lighthouse that bit the sky like a white fang. Mira said, "The lens remembers what light forgets." Aria tested the rusted door and pushed. Stairs spiraled up, slick with salt. Jax said, "I love stairs that want us dead." Elias climbed and listened for the hum in his bones. Cassian had once laughed here, and that echo wrapped his ribs. At the lantern room, Mira unrolled a vellum map that smelled of rain. Aria said, "Malric forged a lunar channel." The map glowed, and lines webbed the coast. Elias said, "A path to me." Jax whistled low and shut it fast. Mira said, "Break the channel, break his grip." The glass pulsed with the sea below. Aria took Elias' hand and their reflections braided on the pane. For a moment, the change fell quiet. Wind keened, and the room held its breath. At dusk, they crossed the tide flats where the sky wore amber and bruise. Aria said, "He will strike when we trust the quiet." Jax hopped stones and failed with theatrical grace. And Mira marked the sand with salt and iron. Elias felt the pull of the lunar channel like a hook in his chest. Cassian appeared on a distant ridge, a silhouette against moth-blue clouds. Aria said, "He will not choose the dark forever." Elias said, "He already did." Wind lifted Aria's cloak, and light trembled on her throat. Jax said, "We could just not be here." The flats sang with tiny streams finding the sea. Mira said, "We need a keystone, not a prayer." The sun fell, and the first star arrived, early and cold. Elias turned away from the ridge and toward the light in Aria's eyes. The hook loosened, barely. Night pressed close in the salt chapel, a ruin laced with barnacles and prayer glass. Mira said, "Name what you will keep when he tears at you." Elias said, "Names do not hold." Aria set 3 candles and lit them with a breath of soft fire. Jax said, "If the moon bends again, I am hiding under that pew." Wind moaned through ribs of fallen beams. Mira placed iron at each corner and chalked a circle. Aria said. "Stand here and look only at me." Elias stepped in, and the circle warmed underfoot. The change swelled, but her gaze held him. He heard Cassian outside, a footstep that never crossed the door. Elias said, "I am not a weapon." Aria said, "You are a heart." The candles leaned and straightened as the tide shifted. The circle did not break. The rain eased by noon, but the weight of silence clung to Elias as he walked through the charred village square. Aria said, "Every ruin marks us." He touched a scorched wall, feeling heat beneath ash. Mira muttered prayers over a child's broken toy. Jax tossed a pebble and kicked it farther than he meant. Elias whispered, "I feel his hand in every stone." The ward within him stirred like a caged storm. Aria said, "He cannot claim what you want give." Elias looked at her and almost believed. The market stalls sagged with soot, and the air smelled of grief. Mira said, "A village erased is not a lesson. It is a warning." Elias nodded, guilt heavy. Jack said, "If despair had a face, it would sit right there." Elias forced a hollow laugh. Cassian's memory pressed sharp against his ribs. Aria touched Elias's sleeve, steady but soft. He felt seen, fragile, alive. Evening bled across the marshes, painting them copper and green. Elias walked knee-deep in reeds, his reflection fractured. Aria said, "You can't carry it all." He answered, "I was born to carry too much." Mira walked ahead, tracing lines with salt in the mud. Jack said, "My boots are not made for curses." Elias half smiled. Fireflies kindled in the dark, bright as lost hopes. Aria took Elias a hand in the reeds and did not let go. She said, "If you fall, I fall." His chest ached at her words. Cassian's face rose again, torn by conflict, blade trembling in memory. Elias shivered. Mira said, "The marsh remembers sorrow. Leave none here." The moon's edge silvered the water, soft and sharp at once. Elias drew a long breath, a promise unspoken. The inn smelled of smoke and broth, lanterns swaying low. Jax leaned on the counter and said, "2 bowls, 1 full, 1 for sharing." The keeper eyed them but asked no questions. Mira whispered charms into her drink. Elias slumped by the fire, shadows making him look half-beast. Aria said, "Stay awake or dreams will take you." He lifted heavy lids and muttered, "Dreams are kinder than days." She frowned, but her eyes softened. Jax laughed loud enough to break the hush. "If silence kills, then I am a healer." Mira said, "Quiet, boy." Elias stared into the flames, and in them he saw Cassian's blade gleam again. He clenched his jaw until it hurt. Aria touched his arm. He said, "I do not know who I am when it comes." She whispered, "You are more than the change." The fire popped, sparks scattering like warnings. Far on the ridge, Malric stood before his gathered circle, torchlight painting him cruel and sharp. He said, "Every bond they weave is rope I can burn." His followers bowed, silent and afraid. He raised a hand, and the moon flickered darker. Cassian stepped forward, blade lowered. Malric said, "You still tremble. Your heart betrays you." Cassian said, "It is not fear, it is memory." Malric's eyes narrowed. "Then I will unmake memory too." Cassian turned away, face caught between loyalty and longing. The wind howled, scattering ash from their brazier. Malric said, "Bring him to me before the tide breaks, or I will claim what you love most." Cassian closed his eyes, pain twisting his mouth. His silence was a vow he dared not speak. Beneath the willow grove, Elias found a moment's breath. Aria set a lantern by the roots, its glow golden. She said, "The world does not grant us peace, so we steal it." Elias sat, hands trembling but calmer. Jax flopped down and said, "If peace is stolen, I want a bigger share." Mira leaned against bark, closing weary eyes. Elias looked at Aria, saw the soft fire on her face, and forgot the scars of the day. He said, "When you stand near me, The change listens. She whispered, then let it hear my vow. The leaves stirred, though no wind moved them. Jack snored already, pretending sleep. Mira murmured, love is a ward stronger than iron. Elias leaned into the light closer to Aria, caught between fear and wanting. Fog pressed low over the quay as a bell tolled once and died. Silas stepped from shadow, smile thin as wire. Jack said, friend or knife in a nicer coat. Silas bowed amused. He said, I bring a door you cannot find alone. Aria watched his hands and did not blink. Elias felt the channel tug and steadied his breath. Mira said, names are locks, speak none you cannot keep. Silas traced the air, and salt glittered like stars. He said Maurik hunts by moon, so we walk by tide. Jax muttered, I prefer roads that do not breathe. Aria said, guide us but cross no line. Silas' gaze lingered on Elias, searching. He said, your choice will drown a city or free it. Elias answered nothing, because fear had teeth. The bell did not ring again. Wind scraped the masts and carried distant laughter that felt wrong. Mira lifted iron and chalk, patient as prayer. Aria said, we move now, or we are moved. The fog parted like a curtain. They followed Silas to the tide gate, a stone mouth veined with shells and moon metal. Mira said, old work, older cost. Aria set a palm to the lintel and flinched. Elias felt the channel humming, a rope through his ribs. Silas said, it opens to those who carry more than one face. Jack said, so, not me, thanks. Mira breathed on the sigils, and they warmed like coals. Aria said, Elias, stand with me. He stepped close, and warmth climbed his spine. The gate shivered. Silas whispered a word that smelled of copper rain. The stones sighed and pulled apart. Jack said, if this swallows me, tell the world I died pretty. Elias almost smiled. Aria met his eyes and held them. She said, we walked together. The passage yawned, and cold air rolled out, ancient and clean. Mira said, do not speak, do not look back. They entered as the sea exhaled. The passage opened into a cavern of mirrored pools that repeated their faces wrong. Jack said, I look brave, that is suspicious. Silas walked the edges like a cat on glass. Mira said, reflections steal what you doubt. Elias saw himself with Maurik's smile and felt sick. Aria said, look at me, not at ghosts. He did, and the echoes steadied. A hiss coiled from the dark and became three pale creatures, all mouth and bone. Silas said tide whites, hungry for vows. Jax lifted a hook and tried not to shake. Mira rang iron on stone, sharp and bright. Aria said, back to back. Elias felt the change tap his spine like a drum beat. He said, hold me to human. Aria answered, hold me to light. The whites rushed. Iron sang, Dut Iori. Water leapt. The air tasted of salt and old promises. In the end, only ripples moved. They reached a skylight shaft where rain fell in a straight silver rope. Cassian waited at the rim, cloak slick, blade sheathed. Aria said, stand aside. Cassian said, I came to ask him to live. Elias swallowed a storm of answers. Mira said, speak quick, the sky is thin. Cassian stepped down, eyes bright with ruin. He said, Maurik will break the city to break you. Elias said, you chose him. Cassian winced. I chose what I thought would save you. Jack said, terrible plan, would not recommend. Cassian laughed once, then almost broke. Aria stood between them, unshaken. She said, he is not yours to save or to destroy. Rain stitched their silence into something sharp. Cassian said, there is a keystone under the moon tower. He looked at Aria. Guard him, or I will. Elias felt the channel loosen, then pull tight. They emerged at the moon tower's root, a forest of fallen arches and whispering grass. Silas said, here the channel nods. Mira laid out iron, salt, and a shard of prayer glass. Aria said, "We cut the knot without cutting him." Elias felt heat gather beneath his skin. Jax said, "Tell me where to hit, and I will hit it gently." Silas laughed, soft and wrong. "Gently will kill him slower." Aria's glare ended that smile. Mira said, "On my mark. Speak truth and nothing else." The ground thrummed like a drum in a chest. Elias said, "I am not your weapon. I am my own choice." The knot shivered. Malric's voice rode the wind, velvet and cruel. He said, "Then choose me and be at peace." Aria said, "He chooses life." The arches rang, and light cracked the knot. The pull receded, not gone, but less. Jax breathed out a curse that was almost a prayer. The night was restless, clouds racing over the broken plain. Elias and Cassian faced each other under the ruins of a shattered bridge. Cassian said, "You think love absolves you, but it only binds tighter." Aria stood between them, voice steady. "Enough. He is not your enemy." Cassian's hand clenched his blade, trembling with memory. Elias said, "You chose the dark path, not me." Cassian snapped, "I chose survival when you turned away." Jax muttered from the rocks, "And here I thought tonight might stay quiet." Mira lifted her staff, eyes hard. "The moon watches and judges us all." The wind howled through the cracks, scattering dust like ash. Aria touched Elias's arm, her calm anchoring his fury. Cassian's gaze broke for a heartbeat, sorrow surfacing before anger smothered it. He whispered, "I can't let you belong to anyone else." Far across the ridge, Malric spoke to his council in a voice like velvet over steel. "Their bonds grow strong," he said, "but strong bonds break loudest." Flames from braziers licked high, casting monstrous shadows on the stone walls. His eyes glinted with hunger as he raised a silver shard. He said, "The channel bends to me because I feed it with their fear." His followers bowed lower, afraid to meet his gaze. One asked, "And if Cassian fails?" Malric smiled thinly. "Then his heart will serve me more loyal than his hands." He turned to the sky, hand lifted. The moon shuddered, dimming for a moment before flaring cold white. He whispered, "Let them think they have hope." His cloak spread like wings, and the fire guttered, obeying him. The group stopped in a hollow of black pines, lanterns barely pushing the dark back. Silas leaned against a trunk, smirk curling. He said, "Every oath costs more than it pays, and you will bleed soon enough." Jax rolled his eyes, comforting, "Thank you." Mira snapped, "Stop toying with truth." Aria said, "We need him, but trust is thin." Elias studied Silas, uneasy at his shifting tone. Silas whispered, "When the tide turns, remember I offered you more than honesty." Elias asked, "And what price?" Silas only smiled, teeth pale in the lantern light. The pines creaked as if listening. Aria stepped closer to Elias, steady but tense. Jax kicked pine needles, muttering. Mira drew a ward on the dirt, circle steady, voice low. The lantern flame flickered and almost died. On the outskirts of the marsh, they found ambush waiting. Hooded figures rushed from reeds, blades flashing dull silver. Jax said, "Called it." Elias shifted half into shadow, snarling with control. Aria's palm burned bright, cutting through fog. Mira struck with iron, sparks flying. Silas vanished into mist, reappearing behind one enemy, dagger dripping. Elias roared, voice torn, "No more blood." Cassian emerged from the mist, blade clashing with Elias's strike, their eyes locking. "Choose me," Cassian pleaded. Aria shouted, "He already has." The marsh boiled with violence, reeds thrashing as if alive. Mira bellowed a word of binding, and the cultists faltered. The moon slipped free of clouds, silvering the chaos. Breath and blood and choice tangled in the air. When the battle quieted, silence felt heavier than the fight. Elias stood shaking, his skin still flickering with shadow. Aria reached him, her touch steady. She whispered, "We are alive because you chose." He answered, "I don't know if I chose or broke." Mira knelt among the fallen, tracing a ward over each with sorrow. Jax leaned against a reed pole, panting, "Remind me why I didn't run." Silas emerged again, cloak damp, smile crooked. He said, "Because you wanted to see who I'd kill next." Jax groaned, "Charming." Cassian lingered at the marsh edge, not attacking, not leaving. His eyes clung to Elias before turning away. The moon dipped lower, dragging light from the sky. Aria said, "We must reach the tower before hope is gone." Elias nodded, but his heart ached with too many names. Dawn leaked pale over the Moon Tower road as the party climbed in brittle silence. Jax said, "If anyone has a good omen, now is the time." Mira answered, "Omen enough that we still breathe." Silas walked ahead, too quiet for comfort. Aria said, "Stay close to me when the pull begins." Elias felt the channel gnaw, a wolf at the door of his ribs. Cassian stepped from a cleft in the rock and raised both hands. He said, "I can open a safer path." Aria replied, "Your safer paths cut like razors." Silas laughed softly. "Let the penitent lead." The ground thrummed and a hidden seal unlatched. Iron teeth snapped from the stone and split their line. Jack stumbled back, swearing as dust bloomed. Silas darted through the gap and vanished with a grin like a knife. Elias shouted, "Silas!" The rock jaws slammed shut, leaving them one ally fewer and one doubt heavier. They found a ledge to breathe on while the wind scraped the cliff like knives. "Unk." Elias paced the edge and counted heartbeats that would not slow. Aria said, "This is not your fault." He answered, "Everything breaks where I stand." Mira set iron nails in a line and watched them quiver. Jack said, "We have lost worse and kept moving." Elias said, "Silas was a blade, but he was our blade." Aria touched his chest and felt the storm there. She said, "Name what is yours and keep it." He said, "I have a name that shakes." The channel tightened until his breath hitched. Cassian said, "Let me carry the pull for an hour." Aria stiffened, but Elias nodded once. Cassian stepped close and pressed a palm to the ward, eyes shut. Pain braided into relief, bright and terrible. Elias stood still and hated needing an old hurt to stand. By noon the tower's shadow reached them, long as a vow that will not bend. Mira said, "The keystone lies under the western buttress." Jack squinted and said, "Which is the western one when the sky is spinning?" Aria smiled thinly and pointed to a cracked arch veined with moon metal. Elias said, "If we sever it, he loses his hand on my bones." Mira nodded, grave and kind. She placed iron, salt, and the shard of prayer glass in a tight triad. Cassian watched, shoulders squared against guilt. Mira said, "When I call the surge, step back and hold to each other." Aria whispered, "Not alone, teacher." Mira smiled like weathered sunlight. The surge came as a low thunder inside the stones. She drew the force through her circle and into her own chest. Jax yelled, "Mira!" She answered, "Keep the boy upright." The keystone cracked. Her knees folded as the light left her hand. The ground rolled like the sea, and the sky blinked dark as a closed eye. Malric's voice poured from the tower stones, velvet over a blade. He said, "You crack my lock and I break your key." Aria knelt by Mira, pressing cloth to a bleeding palm. Jack said, "If he has tricks left, I am out of applause." Cassian drew his sword and faced the tower door that was not a door. Elias felt the channel yank hard enough to tear breath. Malric whispered, "Kneel and the pain becomes quiet." Aria said, "Stand, and the world stays alive." Lightning crawled down the tower like silver vines. The shards Mira had used went dark, then flared and burst. Jax dragged her back as stone teeth gnawed the ground. Elias staggered and braced on Aria's shoulder. Cassian shouted, "Face me!" Not him. The moon dimmed until the plain went cold. Malric laughed without air. Twilight bled across the ruins as the wind carried iron and rain. Malric spoke from everywhere at once. He said, "Choose Elias, and end the ache. Give me your shape, and I give them breath." Aria rose, throat bright with ward light. She said, "Do not barter with a grave." Cassian stepped to Elias's side and lowered his blade. He said, "If my life buys yours, take it." Jax hissed, "Terrible math." Mira whispered, "No more costs we cannot pay." The tower opened like an eye and showed the city drowning if the channel held. Elias felt the world tilt toward that water. Aria took his hand and said, "I will walk any dark if you walk out again." Cassian said, "Or I go in your place." Elias closed his eyes and tasted salt. He said, "I choose the living, not the quiet." The wind fell, waiting for a price to be named. The moon tower opened like a throat and breathed cold into their bones. Aria said, "Hold to me when it drags." Elias felt the channel rake through his ribs and refused to bend. Mira said, "Let power pass through, not live in you." Jax gripped a rope that led nowhere and said, "I vote for doors, not gullets." Cassian walked at Elias's shoulder, blade low, eyes raw with choice. Malric's voice slid along the stones like oil. He said, "Brave light, sweet leash, bring him home." Aria answered, "He is not a dog to your chain." The floor thrummed and sigils rose like frost underfoot. Elias said, "I am done being pulled." His outline shivered, then steadied. Mira guided his breath until it matched the tower's slow thunder. Jax said, "If anyone asks, I was very heroic and did not squeak." Cassian almost smiled and did not. Elias stepped ahead and the drag lessened. They reached a chamber of mirrors that did not reflect light, only longing. Cassian said, "Let me stand first." Aria said, "Do not trade one tether for another." The mirrors woke and showed Elias kneeling at Malric's feet. Elias said, "Break them." Mira answered, "We break them by speaking true." Jax said truth and then smashing, in that order. Cassian faced his own ghost, a man who had chosen power and lost love. He said, "I was wrong, and I kept being wrong." The ghost smiled with perfect cruelty. Aria stepped to Elias, steady as tide. She said, "You are not a weapon, you are a vow." Cassian struck the mirror that carried his hunger. It cracked like ice in spring. Malric whispered, "Confession is a door I own." Elias laughed once, ragged and alive. He said, "Then we walk through," and bolted behind us. The tower heart waited, a wheel of stone teeth around a pool of night. Malric stood within the water as if it were glass. He said, "Lay down your wild, and I will spare your city." Elias said, "I will not buy peace with a stolen self." Aria lifted her ward, and the air brightened. Mira placed iron at the wheel's four winds. Jax said, "Please, tell me this is the part where we win loudly." Malric smiled, almost kind. He said, "I taught the tide to love me, and it loves to drown." Water rose with delicate malice. Cassian stepped in front of Elias and crossed his blade with light. Aria said, "Hold to breath, not fear." Elias felt the change surge and chose to ride it rather than fight. His outline blurred into strength without losing name. Malric's eyes narrowed like knives. He said, "Interesting and unacceptable." A new door opened in the air, and Silas stepped out laughing softly. He said, "I always arrive when the bill is due." Aria said, "Choose us or choose yourself." Silas looked at Elias longer than was safe. He said, "I choose the one who returns my name." Malric offered a nod that promised riches. He said, "Come, little mirror, and be seen." Silas flinched at the word and bared his teeth. Jax said, "If he betrays us, I get 2 punches." Mira murmured, "He has been a knife looking for a hand." Silas sliced his own palm and fed the tower a drop. He said, "I owe no master now." The tower groaned as a lock slid free. Malric hissed and the water surged. Aria caught Silas' wrist and held him upright. Elias said, "Stand with us or fall alone." Silas smiled like a wound and nodded once. The wheel turned, and the city's distant lights flickered like drowning stars. Malric said, "Decide now. Give me your shift, and I seal the sea." Aria said, "He is not yours to spend." Elias felt the pull thread through every scar. Cassian whispered, "Take me instead." Jack said, "Bad plan, still consistent." Mira's voice shook but held. She said, "There is a third path. Break the wheel and teach the tide a new name." Elias stepped into the pool and found stone beneath. He said, "I choose the living, and I choose change that serves." The channel bucked, as if shocked. Aria put her palm to his back and anchored him. Cassian set his blade to the gear and pushed. Silas fed another drop and laughed through pain. Malric screamed a word that cracked the air. The wheel shattered, and the tide hesitated like a stunned heart. The tower shook like a dying heart as water roared up its walls. Malric screamed, "Yield or all drown." Elias braced in the pool, his shadow shape steady. Aria said, "He is not yours." Cassian raised his blade, light flashing against water. Mira cried, "The wheel is broken. Bind him now." Jack shouted, "I'll take the left, someone take the rest." Silas hissed, "Hold the knot or lose the city." Elias roared, "I am not your weapon. I am my choice." His voice cracked stone. Malric staggered, his smile breaking, and the tide froze mid-surge. Malric raised a final shard of moon metal, his hand bleeding. He whispered, "If I fall, I take the tide with me." Cassian leapt, striking steel to steel. Aria pulled Elias back, crying, "Do not let him anchor you." Mira shouted, "Seal the shard with truth." Elias lifted both hands and said, "I am both man and beast, and I belong to neither chain." The shard cracked. Malric shrieked, his power unspooling into the air like smoke. The tower shook and light burst in a storm of glass. Jack shouted, "Everyone down." The water fell silent, spilling harmless into the pool. Malric lay broken against stone, breath shallow, eyes hollow. Elias said, "It ends here." Malric rasped, "You cannot kill what the tide remembers." Cassian lowered his sword, but kept his stance. Aria said, "You will not rise again." Mira pressed iron to his chest, voice sharp, "The tide remembers, but it will not obey you." Malric's eyes flickered once, then went dark. Jax whispered, "Please tell me that was it." Silence stretched, heavy as judgment. Elias exhaled, his shadow steady at last. They climbed from the tower ruins into dawn's pale fire. The sea was calm, the city lights unbroken. Jax fell onto wet grass and laughed, "We lived, which is against all odds." Mira leaned on her staff, weary but alive. Cassian looked at Elias, voice rough, "I would trade my blade for your forgiveness." Elias met his gaze and said, "Forgiveness is a path, not a gift." Aria touched Elias's hand, warmth steady. She whispered, "You chose life, and it chose you back." Silas smirked faintly, "Then perhaps I will stay, for now." The wind smelled of salt and ash, and hope. Night fell again as they camped near the shore. The fire snapped, sparks rising to meet stars. Jack snored already, curled in cloak. Mira whispered prayers into the tide. Cassian kept watch, his eyes heavy with regret. Silas carved lines into driftwood, expression unreadable. Aria leaned against Elias, her hand on his chest. She said, "Your heart beats steady now." Elias whispered, "Because it beats with more than mine." Their lips brushed under the fire's glow, fragile yet fierce. The tide rolled quiet, no longer a chain but a song. The night ended with silence full of promise.